What if everything you believe about money, power, and the global economy is completely wrong? Not slightly wrong, but fundamentally misunderstood. Because most people believe something very simple. They believe that governments control the economy, that presidents, prime ministers, and political leaders are the ones making the big decisions, the ones steering the direction of entire nations, deciding whether economies grow or collapse. It sounds logical. It feels right. It's what we've been told our entire lives. But if that were true, why do financial crises keep happening? Why do markets crash again and again, even when governments promise stability? Why does inflation suddenly rise and make everything more expensive, even when leaders say everything is under control? If governments truly had control, wouldn't they stop these things from happening? Wouldn't they protect the system? Wouldn't they prevent economic disasters? But they don't, and that's because they can't. There is something deeper, something hidden in plain sight, something that doesn't appear in headlines but shapes everything behind them. A system. Not a person, not a company, not a single decision. A system built over decades, layer by layer, through crises, decisions, and constant change, until it became so complex that almost nobody fully understands it anymore. Every single day, you wake up and participate in that system. You go to work, you earn money, you spend money, you save money, you invest money, and without even thinking about it, you trust it. You trust that your money has value. You trust that your bank account is real. You trust that the numbers on your screen actually mean something. You trust that tomorrow everything will still function, that the system will still be there, stable, reliable, predictable. But most people never stop to ask one simple question. Why? Why does money have value? Why does this system exist? Why does it work the way it does? And more importantly, who actually controls it? Because once you start asking those questions, you begin to see things differently. You begin to notice patterns. You begin to question assumptions. And slowly, the illusion starts to break. Let's start with the biggest illusion of all, the idea that governments control the economy. It's everywhere. In the news, in education, in public discussions, we are constantly told that governments manage the economy, that they guide growth, stabilize markets, and protect people. But here's the reality. Governments don't control money. And if you don't control money, you don't control power. Because money is not just a tool. It's the foundation of the entire system. It determines what gets built, what gets funded, what survives, and what disappears. Without control over money, power is limited. So if governments don't control money, who does? That's where everything changes. Because the answer is not obvious. It's not visible. It's not something people talk about every day. The control begins with institutions that operate in the background, central banks. These are not normal banks. They don't serve everyday people. They don't compete in the market like businesses. They operate above it. They control the supply of money. They decide how much exists. They influence interest rates. They shape inflation. And with a single decision, they can change the direction of entire economies. But most people never notice it because it doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't feel emotional. It feels technical, complicated, abstract. And that's exactly why it's so powerful, because people ignore what they don't understand. Now imagine this. A small group of people sitting in a room deciding whether money should become cheaper or more expensive, deciding whether borrowing should increase or slow down, deciding whether markets should rise or fall. Those decisions don't just affect banks, they affect everything. Your job, your rent, your groceries, your future. When interest rates go down, money becomes cheap. People borrow more, businesses expand, markets rise. Everything feels good. Everything feels like growth, like opportunity, like progress. But when rates go up, everything changes. Borrowing becomes expensive, spending slows down, growth weakens. And suddenly things feel uncertain, unstable, fragile. This isn't random. It never was. It's controlled. But even this is only one layer of the system. Because behind the markets, behind the companies, behind everything you see, there are even bigger forces. Forces that don't appear on the surface, that don't make headlines, but control enormous amounts of money. massive investment firms. These firms manage money at a scale that is almost impossible to imagine. Trillions of dollars, more than entire countries. And that money doesn't just sit there. It moves, it flows, it spreads across the entire global economy, into companies, into industries, into infrastructure, into everything. And this is where everything becomes even more interesting. Because once you start to understand the system, you begin to realize something deeper. The system doesn't just influence the economy. It shapes reality. It shapes what people believe is possible. It shapes opportunities. It shapes outcomes. Think about it. Why do some companies grow massively while others disappear? Why do some industries dominate while others collapse? Why do certain technologies get funding while others never take off? These decisions are not always visible. They are not always obvious, but they are connected to the flow of money, and whoever influences that flow influences everything else. Now imagine how this plays out on a global scale. Entire countries depend on the system. Their currencies, their economies, their stability are all connected to global markets, all influenced by capital flows, all dependent on confidence. Because at the end of the day, the system runs on belief. Belief that money has value, belief that markets will function, belief that tomorrow will look similar to today. But what happens when that belief starts to break? History has shown us the answer. Markets crash, banks fail, economies collapse, and suddenly everything changes. But even in those moments, the system doesn't disappear. It adapts, it restructures, it evolves, and often it becomes even stronger. Because every crisis reshapes the system. It removes weaknesses, it creates new rules, it concentrates power, and over time it builds something even more complex, even more interconnected, even more difficult to understand. Now think about how few people actually see this. Most people focus on headlines. They focus on short-term events. They react to what's happening right now, but they never step back to see the bigger picture. They never look at the structure. They never question the system itself. And because of that, they remain inside it without understanding it. But once you start to see it, you begin to notice something else. Patterns, cycles, repetition. Booms followed by crashes. Growth followed by slowdowns. Expansion followed by contraction. Again and again, over decades, over generations. It's not random. It's the system moving, adjusting, correcting itself. And the deeper you look, the more predictable it becomes. Not in exact details, but in structure, in behavior, in patterns. Now consider this. If a small number of institutions control massive amounts of capital, and that capital flows into nearly every major company, then influence becomes concentrated. Not absolute, but significant. Enough to shape direction, to shape priorities, to shape outcomes. And this influence doesn't need to be visible. It doesn't need to be announced. It exists within the system itself, within ownership, within incentives, within structure. And that's what makes it so difficult to see, because there is no single moment where everything becomes obvious. There is no single point where someone explains the entire system. It's something you have to piece together step by step, layer by layer, until it starts to make sense. Now think about your own life. Your job, your income, your expenses, your future. All of it exists inside this system. All of it is influenced by forces you don't directly control. Interest rates, market conditions, economic cycles, global events. All connected, all part of the same structure. And once you realize that, you begin to understand something important. The system doesn't revolve around individuals. Individuals exist within the system. And the system follows its own logic, its own rules, its own patterns. Now here's the key realization. The system is not necessarily designed to harm people, but it is not designed to protect everyone either. It is designed to function, to continue, to sustain itself. And in doing so, it creates outcomes. Some people benefit. Some people struggle. Some people rise. Some people fall. And all of it happens within the same structure. Now think about how powerful that is. A system that continues regardless of individuals. A system that adapts regardless of intentions. A system that shapes outcomes without needing a central controller. That is the real power. Not a single person, not a single company, but the system itself. And once you understand that, everything starts to look different. Markets are no longer random. Crashes are no longer surprising. Growth is no longer mysterious. It all fits into a pattern, a structure, a system. And the more you observe it, the more you understand it. Now here's the final piece. Why don't more people talk about this? Why isn't this common knowledge? Because it's complex. Because it takes time to understand. Because it doesn't fit into simple explanations. And because most people never look beyond the surface. They focus on what's visible, what's immediate, what's easy to understand.